It's bang on 7. Let's get underway. Can I say what a pleasure it is. First one back. So first one in about 19 months, and it's just so happy to be here to welcome you all to King's and to what is the 53rd Strand Group event. My name's John Davis. I'm director of the Strand Group and also part of this process. So tonight, we're going to be talking about the making of Blair and Brown, the New Labour Revolution, which I think I think the worst review I saw was from The Guardian, who gave it 3 stars, through gritted teeth, I think. But I think it's been, it's just been an incredible thing to be a part of. Can I introduce what a wonderful panel? I mean, first of all, the actual idea for this event came from somebody who's not here, and that's Steve Condy, who was the executive producer and director of episode 3. And on Sunday night, I got an email from him saying, I've gone down with COVID. And his voice has gone, so we couldn't even have him as a big brother figure. But I'm sure that we can certainly make up for that. So on my left here, I've got Liz Mermin, who was director of episode 2. I've got John Rentoul, my fellow author, and we'll talk about that in a second, but also fellow series consultant, and then last but definitely not least, Ed Balls, who I think's in every episode, aren't you, Ed? I think every episode. Most.
I think I'm not in the Iraq episode.
But you should have been, though, right? You should have been.
Discuss.
Well, so yeah, let's get it underway. So the way that this is going to work is that first of all, me and JR are going to talk about our role, how we came to be a part of it. Then we're going to show you some clips. Then we're going to hand over to Liz to talk about her views on it, and then we'll hand over to Ed, and then questions, and out of here by 8:15. So without further ado, John.
Thank you very much, John. Well, I've been on cloud 9 ever since the programme came out, because although we're listed as consultants, we had nothing to do with it. But I've been taking all the credit for the work that Liz and Steve and all the people who made those programmes did. I mean, it's just been such a feature of politics. It's been discussed pretty much every day in the media since it aired, because I think it has really sort of triggered memories in the Labour Party about what a successful Labour government looks like, which isn't something that's led by Ed Miliband or Jeremy Corbyn, and I think it's helped restore a sense of history to the Labour Party. But it's also, really touched a chord with a lot of Tories. I think a lot of Conservative MPs talking about the problems you get when there are tensions between a Prime Minister and a Chancellor who wants the Prime Minister's job. And so, it has become part of the national conversation. So congratulations, Liz. But I'll just say briefly how this all started. When Tony Blair stood down in 2007, the skies darkened and the sun hasn't shone since. And John Davis and I felt that a historic injustice was being done to Tony Blair in the sense that he was so hated at the time, and we thought it was our responsibility as contemporary historians to try and rebalance that record. So we set up this module at Queen Mary to teach the Blair government as history, to try and rebalance the perspectives on that period, which we thought was a successful social democratic government, and we thought we would start to push back those perceptions. And of course, we then spent the next 5-10 years watching as Tony Blair became ever more hated year by year, and our task became ever more difficult and depressing. And but that course went down extremely well with the students at Queen Mary and then subsequently at King's, because I think a lot of them enjoyed trying to understand how the warmonger Blair had actually a lot more to him than just the Iraq War, and then in by about 2016, people started hating David Cameron instead, and Tony Blair's reputation started to recover, and it was at that point that John Davis can take up the story.
Well, back in about 2010, we got so much material here because part of the module was to invite senior figures from the period, not just politicians but civil servants too, to the class to actually have first-hand testimony. And we recorded this and transcribed loads of it. And Oxford University Press contracted us. That was in 2010. We worked so hard. And 10 years later, the book came out in 2019. Plenty of excuses there, some of them good. And what was interesting in March 2019, when the book finally arrived, was that we were expecting a real pushback, but a bit like, on a smaller scale, I think, the book landed, and immediately Ian Martin in the Times went, this has made me nostalgic for serious government. The Spectator, Alan Johnson writing in there saying how an account like this is long overdue. Very, very pleased to hear that, obviously, but a bit surprised, because potentially, maybe for about 15 years, there really hadn't been a book that had come out being even mildly pro-Blair. And so maybe that was sort of like one of those moments that like the tide started to move just a little bit. And in the summer of 2019, we received an email from the BBC saying, we've read your book. You may have seen our recent series on Thatcher. We're looking for the next project. Would you like to have a conversation? We had many conversations, first of all in person, and then as COVID descended, many of them virtually. And what happened over the next 2 years, COVID really pushed it back about 9 months, a year, the entire project, didn't it? Was many conversations, many looking at cuts, many conversations on particular points, many recommendations for people, and so eventually, 2 months ago, we could put out the social media saying, well, 2 years in the making, something's about to land, and so I think we're going to show a short series of clips to actually show what we've all been up to. Run VT.
Have we got all these questions done then?
Yeah.
I tell you, one of the mistakes that people often make is that they think everyone, has this sort of romantic nostalgia about the past. That they don't. What they actually are addressing most of their lives is a better future for themselves.
Tony had begun to ask some fairly fundamental and searching questions about the Labour Party, ones that I don't think Gordon would ever really have posed.
Okay. As soon as you hear the buzzword social justice, we need to be here. Right, okay.
What Gordon had was a terrific 24/7 ability just to tear into the Tories.
The Conservatives have no conception of social justice. They've got no theory of just distribution.
He just didn't view them as political opponents. They were sort of battlefield adversaries.
Manufacture or die.
Hang on a second, Mr. Tish.
But Tony was actually asking himself whether there weren't some things that the Tories had perhaps got right. People say they were like two peas in a pod. I'm not sure that that's true. If you were to take what later became known as New Labour, Tony was much more new, Gordon was much more Labour.
Labour's massive victory in the general election took visible shape in Parliament today as their new MPs overflowed the government benches.
Prime Minister. Madam Speaker-elect, there are many new faces, as you have said, for you to get used to. Indeed, there are many new faces for me to get used to.
You know, you come into government, one of the disadvantages is inexperience, and one of the advantages is in a sense that sometimes in that inexperience you think you can do things that seem impossible.
Would my right honourable friend confirm that there's a particular responsibility on the part of the IRA to end their murderous and terrorist campaign, which has caused only pain and suffering and numerous deaths during the last 25 years?
No, I remember there was a Monday morning and he sort of bounded into the offices and he sort of said, I've worked out how to do Ireland. I've worked out how to do it.
I remember saying to him, do you know the full history of Northern Ireland? No, he said, because I was saying it's terribly difficult, as I would, being a good civil servant. And he was saying, no, but we can do it. I'm sure we can do it. And it was testing out his own private theory that he could make things happen when others had failed.
I suspect that Tony never really stopped feeling slightly guilty. And somehow this notion that Gordon had given it to him, or that Tony had taken it from Gordon, it never quite went.
Was there a kind of emotional block or a sense of some obligation you had to him that was an issue in your relationship?
Yes, of course. I mean, I had a... Gordon and I were as close as two people could ever be in politics. You know, and I had a deep respect for him and affection for him that no amount of squabbling could ever erase, by the way. So, yes, of course, I felt an obligation to him. And I felt also a deep attachment to him, even when we were having difficult times.
Friendship in politics is very important because you need to be able to work together, but it doesn't always work out because everybody has different priorities and they have different preferences.
It was a very unusual political relationship, probably as a result of having been too close. Maybe two people can never be that close in politics.
Biological and chemical weapons, as opposed to the capability to develop them, has turned out to be wrong. I acknowledge that, I accept it. But I can't sincerely, at least, apologise for removing Saddam.
But he didn't get very much further before the first interruption, a lone protester shouting that Mr. Blair had blood on his hands.
No, that's fine, sir, you can make your protest. Just thank goodness we live in a democracy and you can.
You have to know that Tony is a very, 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 very good presenter. But, I mean, it's true in politics. If you've done something, you tend to defend yourself. I mean, if he now said, you know, something, I made a mistake, I mean, that would be a crumbling of his kind of persona, wouldn't it? So he has to keep going with it.
To cut straight to the point, the thing I reproach myself for more than anyone else reproaches me, and the mistake that we made was very, very clear. And it wasn't a mistake of deceit, and it wasn't a mistake even particularly of organization. It was a failure to understand that the Middle East is gripped by deep forces, particularly of religious-based extremism. Once you remove the dictator, those forces erupt and make it extremely difficult to govern the aftermath. mean, there's no point in look, I'm just not of the school of politics that thinks it's a great thing just to keep displaying your emotions to people. It's not the relevant point. You know, in the end, my emotions are not the important thing. What I feel is not the important thing. These questions of legacy and how people view my government or view the decision on Iraq, it's not something, I don't spend my time worrying about that. I do spend my time worrying about where the Middle East goes and the place of Iraq within it. Yes, I do, because I feel responsibility for it. But the questions of legacy is not going to be determined by me. It's going to be determined by history.
I quoted Winston Churchill to everybody who was sitting around that dinner table. He had said of the 1930s that politicians had been resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, and all-powerful for impotence, and we could not allow ourselves to be in that position.
Can I start? You're out, thanks. Let's go. Let's go, please.
Sarkozy gave a quite histrionic account of how no one had an idea what to do. And at the end of it, he said, the problem is no one has a plan. And there was silence. And Barack Obama tapped the microphone and just said, I think Gordon has a plan.
Gordon Brown called it the start of a new world order. Barack Obama said the G20 summit was historic.
There we are. Okay. So now I'm going to pass over to director of, I think, I like them all, but my favourite episode, Liz.
You'd say that to me. Thank you. I wouldn't normally have notes, but I'm also channeling Steve, who had a long talk with me this afternoon, and because obviously, although I did episode 2, I mean, there were 5 directors on this series, we all worked closely together and spoke to each other and compared notes, so I have a familiarity with it all, but a lot of I'll talk about all of this, and some of it will be channeling Steve. And I just have to say, it's such a pleasure. It's the first time I've met John and John, the Johns, as we called them, because the moment we were supposed to meet and then everything shut down, but it was, so we had endless Zoom calls, but your help in especially selecting interviewees, because we had such an incredibly rich, selection of people to choose from, and you both have very good instincts in terms of who are good interviews. They were really, really targeted. You really pointed us in the right direction in terms of who would be good storytellers, gave us little warnings, so. Well, Ed was already invaluable. When I came, I think Ed was talking to, calling Steve every other day. But we'll get to that later,
yeah.
The Gordon part. We'll get on to the Gordon part. But Steve wanted me to, especially given the audience and the setting, first of all, make clear what we weren't trying to do with this series. And obviously what we weren't trying to do was make the film version of the book. Documentaries are not a very good place for political analysis. I mean, there are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, what we wanted, much as Steve had done in the Thatcher series, was to bring out the personalities, tell the personal stories, and make you feel like you were in the room. This is a kind of in-the-room filmmaking is what we call it. Everyone's an eyewitness. If there's analysis, it's from someone who was in the room. So we don't have any, as you may or may not have noticed, there are no historians, there's no outside experts. It's really getting the characters and the personalities and bringing them together and letting them tell their stories. And our job is to cobble all those different perspectives into something that makes some sense and leave it to all of you, to the audience, to sort of draw their own conclusions and figure out what you make of what they have to say as we have presented it. Obviously there were a huge amount of painful decisions that had to be made. I mean, this easily could have been a 10-part series instead of 5-part series, although we probably wouldn't have had quite the great reviews we did. But we all felt that there were, so many things that we wanted to fit in and we couldn't. But I'll talk a bit about those 5 clips and why Steve chose those and what we were trying to do in each of the episodes. So the first one kind of sets up this new and labor motif, which goes through the whole series. And as Steve says, and he said Ed has a strong view on this, people still argue about how different Blair and Brown actually were in their views. But that argument is ongoing, and it threads through the whole series, and it continues to this day. But I think the message that we're trying to get across in that first episode was that Gordon was the labor. He had a connection to place, he had a connection to the history, and he really identified with the notion of being in labor and wanted to do something within and for the Labour Party and of the Labour Party. I'm terrified saying this without looking at me.
A small more.
This is all channeling Steve. Don't blame me if I get it wrong. No, and whereas Blair was much more, it was the new. He wanted to, well, the way Steve put it was he was more mercurial, and he was looking for a new place to bring a new progressive politics, and he happened to find a place in the Labour Party. I'm not sure I would say that, but that is the way Steve saw it. And what he was really excited about was social justice, maybe rooted in his Christianity, his values, and this obsession with the modern, which I hope comes across in the series. The number of times he used the word modern in his speeches in those early years and in opposition is really astonishing. So we're trying to get at the sort of, they were complementary forces, but they weren't, they were different forces. And they probably, spurred each other on in a very important way. So that's kind of the main theme in episode 1. Episode 2, which I obviously have more to say about because I directed, the reason we chose that clip is there's something really fascinating about, so episode 2 covers, episode 1 is sort of about how they met, how they got into politics, establishing their personalities, and how they met and how Blair ends up becoming leader. Episode 2 begins with the 97 election, and they come in with a landslide, and it's very striking, Blair in his interview saying, I didn't feel like celebrating, I was very apprehensive. Brown also, the clips from that day, you can see none of them are willing to, the polls close and they say, you've won, it's a landslide, and they'll say, no, we'll wait and see, we're not going to say, we can't take anything for granted, and Blair tells them to call the Labour Party headquarters and tell people to stop celebrating. We never know what's going to happen. And so this sense of we've been almost 20 years in opposition, and now we're actually in government, and this is going to be hard. There's something very touching about the way they spoke about that. But as he says, the lack of experience is both, obviously it's a problem, but it also leads you to believe you can do things that you might not otherwise believe you could do. And they have this huge majority, bigger than they'd ever imagined, as he makes clear in that first appearance in Parliament. And that lovely bit where Campbell and Wilson are describing that conversation, it's the kind of Bambi part of Blair that people used to talk about, the sort of eager and slightly naive, which is obviously a caricature, which, the eagerness, I think, is fair. The naivete, you can argue about how real that is. But I think that, bounding in with this enthusiasm, rushing off to Northern Ireland, and the big story in episode 2 really is the Good Friday Agreement, which I think, you could argue was the greatest achievement of New Labour. Tom Kelly, who is one of my favorite voices in that episode, talks about the ingrained pessimism that most people felt around this issue. And Blair doesn't have any of that. And he comes in and he's got the political capital. He says, I have the political capital. He could go meet with Sinn Féin. He could bring them to Downing Street. He could do all these things that no one else would have been able to do because they were so secure in their position. And Blair didn't believe in, that's not the way you do it. So that was, it was great to be able to tell that story through that episode. And I think, similarly, there's, Brown has that same, we tell the story of how he, gives the Bank of England independence and his first budget and the windfall tax, kind of bursting in, jumping in, going straight to work, without any, again, like I'm not going to wait and learn how to do this. I'm going to go in, I'm just going to get going. Although, well, there was quite a bit of time about being careful and cautious in that, on the one hand, very bold, on the other hand, economically quite cautious. I'm sure Ed can talk more about that, but desperately wanting to show that labor could be trusted with the economy. And it's amazing to me now listening to, you listen to the news now and you hear exactly the same lines from the Tories about how you can't trust labor with the economy. You're thinking, what? After all this time, it's insane. But and it made me realize, as obviously I'm not British, I'm an outsider, how deep, I mean, even after studying it, I knew that those prejudices and those assumptions were deep, but the fact that they're still there now is incredible to me, given where we are with the Tory government. But anyway, that's beside the point. I think the other thing that was really interesting about that period in '97 was this idea of, well, I'm just going to give you this quick anecdote. The benefit you have of having me here is I can tell you things that aren't in the film, but maybe should have been if it had been longer. But there's a wonderful bit, and we did talk a lot with John and John about what happens when you get into government, and there was from opposition and the lack of experience, and it's a very different system than the American system. What I can bring to it as a foreigner is seeing that and marveling at it. And Robin Butler said, our system is insane. You come, the new prime minister comes in after 2 weeks of campaigning, they haven't slept, they're, physically exhausted, and then they've been out celebrating, and they come in and they're expected to make some of the most important decisions a prime minister is ever going to make. And, they don't even know their way around Downing Street. It's crazy. And there's a wonderful line where Blair says he walked, Robin Butler led him into the cabinet room, and he walked in and he sat down, and Butler says to him, well, now what? And then Butler says, I told Blair I'd read his manifesto, and I said we were ready to, act on the points in it, and he looked rather surprised. So, just these wonderful details of going from desire to reality, I found really fascinating. Episode 3 was Steve's episode, and that's the one that really dives into the Blair-Brown relationship in a personal way. And I think, a few things that are important to know when you're watching the series. This is, I believe, the first time that they've sat down together, and not that they were together, they were very far apart, but have been in the same program. The way we were able to intercut them and their views has not been done before. And we did not know until the very last minute whether we were going to have both of them at all. So when we directors all came on board, we had to plan how we would make this film if we didn't have either of them.
Which one was more reluctant?
I might get to that in a moment. It was an interesting metaphor for the whole, yeah. So, I mean, we had the model of the Thatcher series, where obviously Thatcher was no longer around, and so you can do these films without either of them, but we kind of knew that it would be better. And so we, poor Ed was subjected to, I don't know how many hours of interviews. We had to really cover our bases in case we didn't get Gordon or Tony. So we had all these.
That's why. That's why there were so many hours.
Well, I mean, you would have been speaking in his stead. No,
The Sunday Times about a week or so ago said that multiple sources had told them that it was Gordon. It was Gordon who
was reluctant.
No comment.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Blair had to, they couldn't say yes right away because Blair's a big, important person, and how would it look to just say yes to the BBC right away? So they strung us along a little bit. But, I mean, he was wonderful, and he we all interviewed him, and he gave us lots of time. And I personally was extremely disarmed by him. I think we all were, preparing to be rather more critical. He was delightful, incredibly charming and modest and thoughtful. And Gordon, I didn't meet, but he had many, probably most conversations. Well, Ed was having quite a few conversations with him, I think. And Steve was talking to him all the time, and he went up to Scotland many times. And then just as he'd said yes, finally, because the other thing, of course, that happened to us was coronavirus. So we were about to start filming when we went into the first lockdown and everything had to stop. And we were all sort of sent our separate ways and told to come back when and if we were allowed to. And then we started up again in the summer. And then I think Brown wanted to go at the end, so when he was finishing his book, and so we had a date in December, and we were at that point finishing our edits because we'd done everyone else in August and September, but it was still possible, and then we went into the second lockdown. And at which point we kind of, you know, I mean, there are budgets and money and schedules and all that, and they had run out. We were supposed to be done with the series, and we didn't have Gordon, and he had said he would do it. So everything had to stop, and all of us directors, being freelancers, went off to do other projects, except, you know, and eventually Steve did get Gordon, but he did get a phone call in Scotland the night before he was supposed to do it, saying that he had changed his mind. And wonderful Steve talked him around. And he was given all of our questions, and he interviewed him for everybody. And, you know, it completely transformed the series, obviously, because suddenly when you have those two voices, then all these other wonderful voices who we had are tampered, you know, they get sort of, you know, they have to be, you have to make way for them. They're just so strong. Even though they're both, you know, Blair is a wonderful performer and Gordon is very guarded, there is something about the way they talked about their relationship, and that's really what you look at in episode 3, which is, I think, gripping. And I'm just looking to see what else. I've been riffing on my own thing, make sure I get Steve's points. Yeah, I mean, just so clearly once we had both of them in the can, we had to go back and revisit, because that relationship became the core, the spine of the series. Steve says that, you know, Gordon says that there's always friction between number 10 and 11, and that there's, you know, this is nothing new, and why are we focusing on it? But I think the feeling that we had across the series was that this relationship really is something unique in politics. It's hard to think of another example of a chancellor and prime minister who were so close. And, you know, if they hadn't been put in that office together when they were, you know, freshman MPs or, you know, their first year, then the whole entire course of political history might be different. They might never have formed this unit and this bond, and it's kind of extraordinary. We do, in a sense, you know, we didn't want, it was a real trick across the series not to find the balance between exploring that relationship but not letting it take over. And I'm thinking, you know, everyone can judge for themselves whether we walked that line successfully or not. It was, believe me, the subject of huge debate among all of us. And in my episode, it looks a bit more at how the camps, Mandelson says at one point, you know, almost immediately people were divided into camps, and how the sort of tensions on the edge around Blair and Brown, who were getting along quite well by all accounts in those first few years, but there's a sort of simmering of tension and competitiveness and protecting my man. Angie Hunter has the wonderful ride. She says, well, I'm not going to say rutting stags, but obviously she did, and you can't quite forget it after she did say it. There's a really interesting, you know, how relevant is that? Obviously, you know, you can overplay it, but was it a healthy competition? Was it, you know, certainly one thing that I was struck by, which maybe doesn't come across quite as well as it could, was how much the media was also obsessed with this. And a lot of the people we interviewed talked about it, and the BBC perhaps is not as self-critical as it should have been, because some of the wonderful Newsnight segments, amazing Newsnight segments, playing this up, got pushed aside among the many tragedies of the Gordon Brown interview. But there were, you know, I mean, they were really playing up these tensions between Whelan and Campbell, and you see a bit of it in the cabinet reshuffle with Diane Abbott and Boris Johnson commenting on how they all hate each other. And I do think there was a bit of a loop if the BBC hadn't, and the other media, of course, hadn't enjoyed picking at it so much, maybe, I don't know, maybe Ed has thoughts on this, it might not have happened in public so much, but this battle sort of was played out in public, and everyone loved consuming it. And so whether, I suppose it's part of their job to control that. Anyway, yes. That's episode 3. Sorry, I'm riffing. The Titanic beasts, in Steve's words, talking in an awkward way. I think that's what's so compelling in that episode. Episode 4, Iraq. Steve chose this clip because it's really sort of astonishing, this admission of what Blair didn't get. And I mean, the sort of like Blair lied, people died, all this stuff. I mean, the feeling that, I didn't do this episode, so I don't want to say my feeling, but certainly from the research I've done, the sense we had collectively, and certainly Pamela, who directed episode 4, had, was that it wasn't so much the lying about WMD. She came to the conclusion that the government believed what they said there. The real catastrophic failure was the lack of understanding, which he talks about, of the context. And I mean, we all know that the lack of planning for the future, but what's so striking, how you can be, you look at Northern Ireland, and in a previous pre-Gordon Brown pushing things aside episode, we also looked at Kosovo and Sierra Leone, and you look at Northern Ireland and what is so important in that, and Blair talks about it, and Tom Kelly they all talk about it, is speaking to both sides, hearing from both sides, listening to both sides, understanding the situation you're going into, which they completely failed to do in Iraq. I made a documentary in America right before the Iraq War, and I could see, I was sort of fed the Iraqi National Congress in Chalabi by a notorious New York Times reporter who was presenting it, who later, fell in disgrace. But, the government, the American government, was listening to a tiny group of people and believing everything they said. And we also interviewed people who said, you will not be welcomed with open arms. There will not be flowers being thrown at troops in the streets. This is not what's going to happen. People want to get rid of Saddam, but you have to get out, and otherwise you won't be accepted, and there will be bloodshed for years. And if I got that as a young filmmaker doing interviews, it blows. I do not understand how Blair and all the brilliant people around him were shutting that message out. And then Steve said that Chirac went to him and said, you cannot go in and you will not be accepted. What was the... Chirac warned him that if you remove Saddam, Iraq will descend into chaos, and you better have a plan and figure out what you're doing. And so why that blind spot existed is the mystery and perhaps tragedy of episode 4. And then in episode 5, the clip we have is the sort of Gordon saving the world from the global recession. It's a lovely clip. And Steve's...
Is that what Barack Obama actually said?
I don't know. I was the education secretary. No idea. I presume so.
It sounds very Obama.
It's in a BBC documentary. It must be true.
How could you even...
It's quite a good line. Stick with it.
It is a good line.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was from a civil servant as well.
Good.
And he would tapping the mic is a believable detail. Sounds very Obama-ish. Anyway, the tragedy which Steve sees, it's weird channeling Steve, I'm not used to talking this way, but the tragedy at the end of this government is, in a sense, that both of them walked away from it with reputations that were the opposite of what they had hoped and what they had wanted. I mean, Blair went in with a real sense of moral purpose and, partly from his faith, but wanting to make people's lives better, wanting to, a kind of caring government that makes real change in how people live, and he walks away being branded a liar with blood on his hands. And Brown went in, thinking I'm the smartest guy in the room, and the one thing you can't question on me is I know how to run the economy, and through no fault of his own, ends up with this label as being the man who broke Britain. And, you know, there's something very tragic about that. And I think what I was trying to get across at the end was the sort of the sense of personal tragedy of having given so much and tried so hard and fought so long, and having these things be what defined them in the end. And I suppose one of the tasks of the series is to remind people of the other things that happened and the other accomplishments along the way. And I think there's Steve mentioned another thing that struck him about it is that both Blair and Brown believed in, they really thought about process and how things are done, and they believed in incremental change is his word. I don't know if you would agree with that. And, you know, moderate improvement, tweaking social services, making things work better. And well, the challenge for us as filmmakers is that, you know, incremental change and moderate improvement don't make for great TV. So it's hard to sometimes do that kind of thing justice. But also we live in a time now when people like big dramatic stories, and that kind of message doesn't work. We live in, you know, and we can talk at another time about why that is, but we're in an era of bombast right now. And does that kind of politics work anymore? Would it work now? It's an interesting question. And is that part of why, you know, why New Labour's been so attacked? Because the ideology is one of, you know, kind of radical moderation and caution. You know, Blair has a line at one point where he says, "A revolution can be quiet, but it's a revolution nonetheless." You know, they really believed they were doing something that was a revolution, but it wasn't what we think of these days as radical change. And I think the last thing I found quite touching, it was interesting when Claire Short was saying in there that, you know, Blair couldn't admit that he made a mistake because that would, you know, destroy the persona. But he had a wonderful, again, line that was in it before Brown came in and we had to make room. Really lovely thought at the end of 99 after the Mandelson resignation. So they were still young. They'd had all these things, you know, that had gone right, but there were some things that were going wrong. And Blair said in the interview that he, you know, went to Ulster and said, you know, I want to give a speech where I say, you know, we're still a young government, we're still learning, we've made some mistakes, but we're getting there. And Ulster said, you can't say that, the public's going to panic. And he said, but, you know, that's what politics is. You learn, and gradually, as you go along, you get better at it. And I think the last thought I had watching the whole series was there's this tragedy. I think Blair says in episode 4, you know, just when you feel like you know what you're doing and how to do it, you have to go. And Brown obviously had to go much more quickly than he wanted to. But this question of, you know, when you have the greatest faith and the greatest momentum and the greatest political capital when you know the least. And the more you do and the more you learn, the more mistakes you made, the more people get bored with, start to dislike you. And actually, when you're most competent, you might in some ways be your least effective, which is an interesting irony.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Ed.
So this is a hard task because there were so many people talking for so many hours in the film. And I'm going to give you a kind of a short view. First of all, in terms of doing it, I did 11 hours of interview over 4 different days. And I think that was fairly common talking to Angie, Alistair. They did the same. And in the old days, when we were in government, we'd have arrived with a press officer, fully negotiated deal, no of those lingering shots before and after. Somebody would have recorded it, and we didn't do it that way. We just turned up. And I think the biggest emotion I had watching the film, I was talking to Angie last week, exactly the same. She said, I watched the whole film thinking, what did I say in those interviews, and are they about to use it? And and so, but the interesting thing is, we all, I think, ended up feeling very relieved about the very honest, open, fair way in which the film had been made. It's an interesting thing, contemporary history. How do you move from journalism to contemporary history? And in some ways, it's the point where there is not yet every source and every book and every paper, but it's the point where people feel able to reflect. And I think if you look, across all the interviews, I mean, I think I've had the great advantage with John of doing now 7 years of the Treasury class since 1945 every Friday, and we spent our whole time reflecting upon all of these years. I'm not sure that everybody in the films was yet quite at open reflection phase. And the challenge for these guys is to make a piece of contemporary history when they have some of those challenges. And it's interesting when people do these hours of interviews, you see the sort of different kind of personality traits coming through. Gordon, bit grumpy, not hugely reflective. Tony Blair, I mean, he wasn't just Jonathan Powell and Alistair Campbell. Tony himself described himself as messianic during the films, and you see quite a lot of those messianic moments emerging. I think one of the really interesting things, I mean, if Gordon hadn't done it, it would have been because he didn't want to make a program which made it about personalities. That was what he was always worried about. It should be about ideas rather than about personalities. But of course, the prism of this relationship is such a fabulous personality story. And I think one of the challenges is that the personality story can be a bit excluding. So, I watched it thinking, I can't believe they didn't have Neil Kinnock, 1985, Bournemouth, as part of the birth of New Labour. I can't believe that John Smith is such a minor footnote in history, when if it hadn't been for his tragic death, he would have been the next Labour Prime Minister in 1997. To me, it was kind of quite striking. Harriet Harman, who was as instrumental in some ways as Peter Mandelson in the kind of the politics of New Labour, wasn't in there. But that's partly because of this personality prism. But on the other hand, it's an amazing story. And you start off with the two of them in their room. And you end when Gordon finally leaves Downing Street in 2010 with, Sue and me and Ed Miliband and Alistair Campbell and Andrew Adonis in the room, Peter as well. And actually you sort of see that there was, those personalities, it's actually more than just two people. There was actually a commonality. If you'd done the Blair years, it wouldn't have been the same as the New Labour years. And at that point when Stuart Wood says it felt like a New Labour wake, you couldn't have captured that without the both of them. And in a way, I think the thing I feel when I look at this, when you look back, and of course it's nostalgic, and to see all of these pictures, you actually do see there was, in their social democratic impulse, a great commonality between Blair and Brown in this project. There was a coming together, which in personal terms, as I say in the film, sticks much, much tighter than people understand. When Tony Blair was deciding to stand down, it was Gordon he rang privately for advice on the words he should use to announce his departure. And it is Alistair and Peter who are with us on the day Gordon walks out to resign from Downing Street. So there's a personal continuity which belies some of the mythology. I'm not saying that there weren't big bust-ups. There were big bust-ups. But there was a depth of personal relationship which outlasts the Tony Blair premiership. But also, look, political parties are coalitions. I mean, that's the nature of a two-party system. Labour's always been a coalition which had to reach, from working class industrial trade union Labour through to metropolitan intellectual Labour. And Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were the duo who managed that synthesis. And within that, there were different emphases. And the reality is, when Peter Mandelson says, which you can interpret, Peter's playing some games here. Tony was more new. Gordon was more Labour. Peter was more Labour. Alistair was more Labour. We were all more Labour. Tony was always pulling against that Labourness. But the Blair-Brown divide, the groups, wasn't a Brownite Labour versus Blairite New. there was actually and that is why you end up with Alistair and Peter in the room at the end of the period. I mean, interestingly, it's a really interesting thought experiment. What would have happened if in 1997 Labour hadn't won the majority? I mean, in 2010, the Tories don't win a majority. David Cameron has to establish a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and you start a set of events which pull apart and fundamentally change the Conservative Party to such an extent that by the end, Boris Johnson is expelling centrist Cameroonian Tories from the Conservative Party in the run-up to 2019 election. What would have happened in 1997 if there'd been a hung parliament and all the talks with Paddy Ashdown had gone somewhere, and if the discussion through Roy Jenkins about proportional representation had gone somewhere? But the reality was it didn't happen. There was a large majority, and from that moment, the two of them were Prime Minister and Chancellor in this together. It could have been different. There was always, though, I think, an element of Tony slightly pulling against that, but he had a large majority, and he had, the ability to do. And if you actually think of the achievements of the New Labour period, and achievement in politics means there's things which become so consensual that they become the cross-party accepted notions of the age. Central bank independence, the national minimum wage, a publicly funded, free at the point of use health service, civil partnerships, and a more open attitude and more modern attitude to civil liberties compared to the debates of the late Thatcher period. Those were never contested. Those were Blair and Brown policies. There have been arguments along the way about how quickly we move here, how much we do that. There was a fundamental commonality on the core elements of the Social Democrat settlement between Blair and Brown. I mean, interestingly, when you look back on the film, there's some things where you look back and think, God, was it really like that? One thing is caution with the media. I get into a discussion about we were the most redistributive government since 1945 in terms of using the tax and benefit system to transfer from rich to poor, but we never spoke about it. And we never spoke about it, not because Tony didn't want to, neither did Gordon. And the reason we didn't was because back then, the media was so much more concentrated and powerful. We live in a much, much more diffuse media age, which in a way I think allows politics to set its own agenda more. But there was Blair and Brown had seen Labour lose lots of times. The media was concentrated and powerful, and they didn't take risks, and that was common. Interesting, though, to look back on it now, because it feels kind of odd. Why wouldn't they say what they were doing? And actually, it feels different now to then. And then actually, I'm going to say something which John will find contentious, and I apologise. I look back at episode 3 and think about the obsession which kind of took hold for a period about kind of privatising public services, the use of the private sector in public services, and particularly in the health service. It's kind of weird now because nobody talks like that. It was this kind of weird aberration which took hold in the view of certain people from about 1999 to 2005, 6. There was a bit of an attempt at this by the early Cameron government, but they scrapped all of that. Chris Grayling's probation reforms, all gone. I mean, it feels like a little bit of a historic quirk that for a period we had this big row about did we want the private sector to have and markets to have a more central role in the National Health Service? Of course we didn't.
Of course we didn't.
And neither did David Cameron or George Osborne in the end either. So what was it all about? And the answer is that during the period when Labour had pressure, in the run-up to 1997, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown both thought they might lose the election. And in the run-up to the 2005 election, they both thought Labour might lose the election. And those were moments of big coming together. And the point when we were pulled apart was the period when the Tories were really weak. It was a catastrophe for us that Ian Duncan Smith became the leader of the Conservative Party after William Hague, because he was so poor. And actually, Michael Howard wasn't a lot better. And the consequence of that was that the only prism which took hold was the Blair-Brown prism. And everything was seen through that. And everybody was positioning. Nobody said, oh my God. I can remember sitting with Tony and Gordon in 1996 and them saying, God, if Ken Clarke takes over from John Major, we could lose. None of us were ever sitting around saying, God, Ian Duncan Smith, he might beat us. And so therefore the issue was not which Conservative might beat us, it was who might take over from Tony Blair as the next Labour leader. And that pulled apart, not necessarily in the core, but more widely, the politics. Let me say a couple more things, John, then I'll stop. I think, you see, when I look at the film, I talked about that commonality. The truth is, they were an effective partnership because they were really happy to tell each other when they were wrong, sometimes quite brutally, and the bust-ups were the things which forged commonality on agendas. And actually, commonality so that we look back and said, we kind of agree on that. In the film, one time where Gordon's not really involved is around the handling of Iraq. One time when Tony's not really involved is Gordon's handling of the election in 2007. Both times, they would have been stronger if they'd got together in a conversation and one of them had said to the other, what are you doing? And it was a great strength within them that they would pull each other back, and they didn't always like it. And actually, the reason why they didn't like it was sometimes because people around them weren't going to like it. I mean, those moments when we would go into these meetings about the health service, and halfway through the meeting, where Alan Milburn was explaining how foundation hospitals were going to borrow off budget because this was our new policy, and Tony would say, Gordon, he said, do we really want to do that? And Gordon would say, no. And Tony said, well, I don't think so either. Alan, why do we want to do that? And Alan would say, well, because it's modernisation, Tony. And Tony would say, well, you know, fine, but I don't think that's a very good idea. We'd all walk out of the room, and Alan was furious because everybody had told him Tony supported this. But he didn't really. Because actually, that, I mean, what was it all about? But they pulled each other back. The one place I would say where, and this is the bit of the film where I just worry about, if you actually think Tony's big incursion into foreign policy through Kosovo becomes Iraq on the global stage. Gordon's big incursion into foreign policy on economic policy culminates really starting from 1997, 98 in financial sector reform through to the global financial crisis. But actually, the sore in British politics was Europe, and Europe and Westminster, and identity, but also economics and migration. And Tony and Gordon were in the same place on migration. Tony and Gordon wouldn't have disagreed on the Mrs. Duffy moment, but it was catastrophic. The referendum, which we sort of hinted at and then pulled away from, we said we'd have, and then we pulled away from, that was common. What were they doing? What was the New Labour vision of Britain's relationship with Europe economically, socially, and politically, which I don't think they ever really established that, against a background of kind of underlying economic stagnation. And that ends up, by the time you get to 2015, 16, 17, becoming a huge problem of identity and also of economics. You don't do the euro in 2003. Actually, I don't mind that so much because I don't really, as you know, I'd never thought Tony wanted to join the euro. I think that was a bit of that sort of Ian Duncan Smith influenced internal politics being played. If Gordon had ever turned around to Tony and said, okay, we should join the euro, he'd have said, Gordon, do we really want to do that? I'm absolutely sure of that. But more broadly, this issue of how you find a place for Britain in Europe, economically, socially, and identity terms, which fits with our sense of ourselves. We didn't succeed on that. And actually, you don't really reflect that in the film. That's the one thing where I feel there's a loss. Although, of course, by the time you get to 2014, 15, 16, what happens? You have a prime minister weakened by coalition, weakened as a result by a Conservative Party pulling apart, feels he has no choice. He thinks politically to have a referendum, has a conversation with his Chancellor, George Osborne, who says, well, you know, I don't think this is actually a very good idea. I don't know exactly what he said, but I believe he said, you know, I think this is a very good idea, but, you know, you're the Prime Minister, and we're friends, and so I'll defer. And the one thing Tony Blair never did is defer to Gordon Brown. And the one thing Gordon Brown never did is defer to Tony Blair, because they always thought constitutionally doing their jobs was more important than friendship. And this idea that friends make better prime ministers than chancellors, and if we agree because we should, makes for better partnerships politically, I think that's wrong. The Blair-Brown partnership was strong because there was a tension, which was often manifested in big policy arguments, but unlike Thatcher-Lawson, for example, it was a partnership which they actually managed to hold together because they had a fundamentally common view of the project. And I think you do capture that in the film. I just sort of feel, looking back, when I think of migration, Britain's relationship with Europe, the way we talked about Europe publicly, I just feel as though that is the part of the kind of, we didn't win an argument for a modern New Labour version of social democracy which had Europe within it. I think that's a failure of ours, and that's the one thing where I think that I'd like the film to have said more.
Wow, there you go. Okay, we've got time for questions. There are roving mics. I can see a few hands up already. Can I have a name, any affiliation, and can you keep your question short, please? Okay, first one, just here. That's right, just there, Martin. In the middle, right there. There we go.
My name is Matthew Seward. Thank you very much. It's a great series. One of the reviews I read talked about those voices that were missing from the interviews because they're no longer with us. People like Philip Gould or Robin Cook or even Paddy Ashdown, as Ed mentioned. So who, alive or dead, who was not interviewed, do you think it would have been good to have interviewed for the series?
I'd have liked to have heard Mo Molam, Tessa Jowl, and maybe a bit of John Prescott as well.
I'd agree with that.
Anyone else?
I think we're all quite taken with Gould, and very sad that you know.
Yeah.
And Mo, obviously.
Okay, there's a question over there, please.
Hi, another Matthew here, Matthew Sarr. Similar theme to the other Matthew. Well, actually, first of all, loved it. Second of all, on a theme of who else wasn't interviewed, my view was that it painted a very positive perspective on Brown and Blair. I suppose I'd be interested to know to what extent that was influenced by the balance or perhaps lack of balance of sources that you interviewed. For example, if you were to have interviewed some Tories or perhaps some Corbynites, there might have been a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a criticism that's often made of our course at King's as well. That we focus on the players in the New Labour government, and we don't have as invited guests critics. But I mean, in the series, they did have William Hague, who I thought was brilliant, Michael Howard, who I thought was rubbish, and Diane Abbott, who has a point of view. But I mean, I think. But the point is, if you're telling the story of New Labour, then you want to hear it from the New Labour people. I mean, you get plenty of correctives to the New Labour story. Those are readily available elsewhere, and to have put a lot of antagonistic voices in the series, I think would have made a completely different programme and a much less interesting one.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry, go on.
I think what I was saying earlier about the voices in the room, I mean, this is the danger with that kind of documentary, but it also involves trusting your audience to understand that that's the conceit. I mean, we did try to get Tom Watson. We interviewed Diane Abbott for quite a few things, but ended up using her a bit judiciously. Claire Short was quite critical, but again, the problem is when you're following this in the room thing, and there's so much going on in the room, and there's so much drama already among those people, when you sit and you edit and you try to get these critical views, you think, well, where were you? You weren't there. And another thing that we don't really get into in the film so much, but which we talked a lot about, was how closed the groups were who were making decisions, how tight the circle was. Loads of people talk about that. There was a real sense, and people are on the outside, like Claire Short say, you were on the inside or you were the outside. You were ignored completely around the cabinet table if you weren't. You know, there was, I mean, you would know better than I, but the impression I got was that there was a, you know, I don't want to say cliquey, but there were small groups who were doing things. And the moment we brought in someone who wasn't, if they weren't talking about something where they specifically were involved, it just felt, it diffused the story. So part of it's just the nature of the kind of filmmaking we were doing.
Right here, please, Jack. Over there. That's it, yeah. Robert, yeah. No? No, Mark, no, Mark, no, Mark, no, up there. No, yeah.
You do, David.
I'm Robert Orchard. I was a very mature student on John's Blair years course. I was also a political and then parliamentary correspondent for the BBC. Just a couple of observations. You were saying about the series that Tony Blair more or less left in ignominy with blood on his hands. As I recall it, on the day Tony Blair left, both sides of the House of Commons gave him a standing ovation. He had won an election, okay, with 36% of the vote, but with the majority in the 60s. I think Blair's reputation began to go downhill in the years after that, after David Miliband narrowly failed to beat his brother. Surely it was the years after, and how Tony Blair then decided to earn lots of money with dodgy middle European dictators. I think it's a long time period over his reputation fell. It wasn't when he left in 2007. And secondly, I thought you were a little bit easy, really, on some of the severest tensions between Blair and Brown. I mean, we all know the quote which was in yours, and I'll put it gently, Gordon Brown saying Tony Blair stole my effing budget with his announcement on health service funding. But I don't think I heard there, I actually heard on the course, it may have been from Ed or it may have been from someone else, that on one occasion Tony Blair had to go to backstairs routes to find out what was in Gordon Brown's budget because his Chancellor wouldn't tell the Prime Minister what was in his budget.
Give us a hint, Gordon. That was it.
I think. Look, I mean, the more interesting kind of question of those two is about place and history. And I think that Gordon probably would have said to me, I've stolen his fucking budget about 5 times a week. I mean, this was sort of, you kind of. There's a certain kind of political journalism which takes these things and makes them something which they aren't. And Gordon might have laughed at that point. Do you know what I mean? You just have to be sort of careful that you take these things out of context. The more interesting thing is place and history, and the nature of contemporary history and its journey to history is about reassessment and but reassessment of the past rather than of the what comes after. So if you take John Major, for example, John Major's place in history, I think, is stronger now than it was when he left in 1997. Not because he said good or bad things about what's happened in the last 5 years, but people look back on the way he handled the dilemmas of being the leader of the Conservative Party at the time of the Maastricht Treaty and think, let's be honest, compared to some people who came afterwards, notably David Cameron, he did a really, really good job. And so the reassessment and the place in history is backward-looking rather than simply from any point in time going forward. Gordon left politics as Prime Minister on 2010 without resounding applause in the House of Commons, and Tony Blair left with resounding applause 3 years earlier. But I don't think there's any doubt that Tony's trajectory since has been downwards on the basis of a reassessment of what happened before with Iraq, whether you think it's fair or not. And with Gordon, there's been an upward trajectory, which the film reflects, based on a reassessment of what he managed to do between 2007 and 2010. Really interesting question if I was writing an essay in our class, which is, would you say the lines have crossed? And I'm not sure I know the answer to that. But what I know is that Gordon's been going up from a low place, and Tony's been going down a bit from a high place, cyclically adjusted. But that isn't about what they've said since. It's about going back and rethinking what you think of those past historic times. So I think if I was Gordon, I'd feel better about my place in history than 10 years ago. And Tony has been fighting to correct the record. As John himself explained, that John John have been trying to do that with him as well, and understandably, because they've been fighting a trajectory which has been harder. And that may be really unfair. I may say to you, look, when I was in the leadership election in 2010 and I was asked, who do I think is the most successful Labour Prime Minister of the post-war period, I said Tony Blair. But interestingly, David Miliband didn't, nor did Ed, nor did, I can't remember the other candidates, the other guys. And I actually think on the domestic agenda, as well as on his election winning, I stand by that. But those people who watch episode 4 take a different view if they place their great emphasis on episode 4. But that is not about what's happened since he left. It's about based on a reassessment of what happened before he left.
I think actually, Ed, from my own point of view, I think that there is a reassessment going on of Blair, actually.
But that's okay.
There is. Yeah. So I think
but compared to there, it's gone down. But as I said, the question is sickly adjusted.
It's such a fascinating issue. We talk about. I think it's fair to say, every prime minister since 1945 has left to negative polling, every single one. And it's a really interesting point about who comes up afterwards. So someone like Attlee nowadays is remembered. I think you've got a forthcoming lecture of the sainted Attlee, JR, right?
Wilson the same.
The myth of the sainted Attlee.
The myth, there we go, the sainted
Wilson,
Attlee.
because of the Ben Pimlott biography, importantly, which was, at the point when contemporary history was starting to become proper history. So, the decisions about Blair and Brown are absolutely not made at all yet. And this programme is an important contribution to something which we're going to be discussing for the next 20 years. John Major too. David Cameron, I'm not sure. may already be decided.
History is dynamic. Down the front here, please.
First of all, it was a brilliant film. I should declare it I was Chief Policy Advisor to John Smith. So I have a perspective on particularly the little. I was also campaigns officer of the Parliamentary Labour Party and spent a lot of time in the famous small room of Gordon and Tony trying to get them to go out on visits to see LPs. But anyway, I have one comment and a question, which is on the comment. I think as contemporary history, it fails. I think as a brilliant sort of greatest hits of New Labour and a sort of insight into the psychiatric couch of the New Labour relationships, absolutely fantastic, thrilling to watch. But from the point of view of history, the one thing that I think is always missed out is how incredibly fortunate Tony Blair and New Labour were. And that I agree totally with Ed. The people left out of the story were the extraordinary act of bravery of Neil Kinnock in 1985 to take on Militant, which changed the whole basis of what was possible. And of course, I've got a bias, but John Smith contributed quite a lot with OMOV, and actually on legacy, it's quite interesting. The single most important politician in making sure we have a minimum wage was John Smith. Actually, he fought for it the hardest against very significant trade union opposition, which people don't understand, and also devolution. So if you look at the big legacies of New Labour, quite a chunk of them, quite chunky bits, come from John Smith. And the luck in all of this is when John died, Labour had a 20% lead in the polls. Within a few weeks of his death, there was a landslide European election led by Margaret Beckett, who it's quite significant. The best Labour result of a women Labour leader was Margaret Beckett. Everyone forgets about that. And also, after Black Wednesday, the Tories had lost leadership on competence of the economy. So in fact, the bedrock upon which New Labour launched, they were very, very fortunate. And I think one of the problems with the new bit of New Labour, and it always makes me smile when, and I don't agree with it at all, but all the Corbynista rubbishing of New Labour, one has to have a slight smile. Well, in fact, quite a bit of the rubbishing of earlier legacies was built into what New Labour salesmanship. I think it was a mistake, by the way, to do that. But anyway, so I think balancing history, we need to understand better the springboard they had, which was pretty favourable, courtesy of Neil Kinnock and John Smith. My question is, and this here I really do want to be a little bit critical, is why didn't you use Robin Cook's resignation speech on Iraq? Because I think not to do that was a major omission.
Thank you.
I cannot answer that question, unfortunately, although it's a very good one, because I didn't do episode 4. I can say, in relation to John Smith and Kinnock, that Kat, who directed episode 1, was, desperately trying, we all were, to get a 2-hour, first episode. I mean, and I saw an early cut which had much more John Smith in it. And I think, as I said at the beginning, one of the things that happened when we did get Blair and we did get Brown was that a lot of these stories really had to, and certainly fair to debate whether the series went too far, or, but it became much more focused on what to do with those two interviews. And as I said at the beginning, it's not, I think, because it's television and it's out there, and it feels like it's a definitive kind of historical statement, but we left out so many things. Devolution, we had lots of conversations about whether to fit in something with devolution. Part of it when you're making a documentary is how good is the storytelling, what happened in the room. If it's just a tick box of what they achieved, well, then someone will say, oh, it was our first year, we did this, 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 and this. But if there's no story around it, it doesn't really fit in a film, and that's the difference between a film and a book. So,
okay.
Fair point.
A very last quick question here, please. Mike, come in there.
Thanks. Margaret Exley, I was on the board of the Treasury during the time Gordon was there, and I also found it absolutely riveting, fascinating, a great, great piece of television. One thing I want to take issue with, and I want to ask a question of Ed on this. You said they were incremental. Now, I sat with these civil servants in the board of the Treasury. It did not feel incremental. We had a demand for child poverty to be reduced, which they felt was an impossible task because it's a relative statistic, but he was adamant. There was, of course, the separation of the Bank of England. There was this massive injection into the health service. There was a complete change in the way the budget was done. I mean, nobody had ever done budgets like this before. It was just felt incredibly bold and radical. And it's interesting that there seems to be a story out there that this is all kind of very cautious and gentle. So my question to Ed is, why is that? It didn't feel like that.
Sorry, why?
Why do people say it was incremental? It never felt incremental at all. It felt a series of radical initiatives coming down in the Treasury.
I think, I mean, just to kind of, to get to an answer to the question, but actually partly to go back to the one up there as well. I say in the film that I don't know what the nature of the Granitas deal was, but I think the most important part of it was Tony agreeing that Gordon would be in charge of economic and social policy. And, it may well have been that Tony also said, I'm not going to serve Prime Minister forever, and Gordon might have foolishly believed him if he said it. But but I actually think they were much more focused on the here and now. And the reality was that Tony was quite happy with that, because there's other things Tony really, really cared about. And I did every budget with Jeremy Hayward and Tony and Gordon. Tony always knew exactly what was in the budget. So did Jeremy. But there were lots of people more widely who really wanted to be really involved in number 10, because that was kind of their job title. And so Tony will have said to them, I know, it's a nightmare, Gordon. Doesn't even tell me what's in the budget. But actually, Jeremy liked being in charge. Tony, I think this wasn't his big priority. He had other things to do. I don't think we really ever had a bust-up over any budget or any of the big economic things. The arguments tended to be outside of the budget process. And I suppose all the things which you have just highlighted there, if you take, for example, 3-year budgeting, comprehensive spending reviews, the golden rule and the net debt rule. I mean, those hadn't been done before until we did them in 1997. It was a really, really big deal. John McDonnell fought the 2017 election on that. And Rishi Sunak has just done a budget in which he's just reintroduced, balancing the current budget over the cycle, the net debt rule. He's done a comprehensive spending review, and he thinks actually it'd be quite a good thing. And the Treasury's talking about whether we actually should go back to some of the output targets which David Cameron and George Osborne scrapped in 2010. Rishi Sunak boasts he's raising the minimum wage more than Labour would. But in 1997, the Conservatives voted against this. And by the way, they also voted against Bank of England independence. But this is now part of the consensus. There was a period where George Osborne said, maybe I don't like these tax credits in the autumn of 2015. And the rebellion against his tax credits cuts at the time was led by Nigel Lawson in the House of Lords. And now it became the universal credit, and it's part of the system. And Rishi Sunak just boasted he's increased it. And actually, the things which become consensual are the things which last. And your goal in politics is to take the radical and then make it consensual, because that's the achievement. But if nobody else is against it because they all think this is a good thing, then, oh, well, you know, Dilo didn't do anything. But actually, the point was the big successes are the things which became part of the, in European terms, the acquis, part of, you know, the commonality. And actually, if you look back pre-97, you know, in the end, David Cameron delivered Labour's mission on civil partnerships into gay marriage. But he did so from a position where in 1997, this was radical what was Labour was doing, because people before that had been voting for Section 28. And now, actually, as well, you know, gay marriage, I mean, of course we're all in favour of that, aren't we? I mean, it's sort of, the Tories supported it. That was a radical piece of Labour policy, which then became consensual and part of the age. So I think it's partly, in politics, you have to accept that when people say you didn't do anything, sometimes it can be because you did things which are so radical and you were so effective at winning the argument that in the end, everybody's now become in favour of it. And you have to quietly think, maybe it was more radical than they realised.
Okay, my friends, we're going to draw to a close there. Can I say a few things? First of all, first one in a while, and it's a big one for us, this. Can I pay tribute to especially Martin, but all of the Strand Group team have put a lot of effort into it.
When was the last one, John?
February, March of 2019. 2020, sorry. 2020.
So this is the first one for 18 months?
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah. You're all invited to a drink. In the -1, it's the Bush House Arcade. Books are available if you'd like to delve a bit deeper, and JR and I will happily sign. Thanks to you all for coming. You can see how happy I am. But also, can I say thank you to a stellar panel, Ed, JR and Liz, for fabulous TV. Thank you.